thingy now.
You look at some of the biggest conflicts that an individual might have: a conflict with their family, a conflict with one of their former close friends, a conflict with a former partner. Those conflicts are often things that do not have black and white. Those conflicts are ones that immensely hurt the individual and continue to hurt them until a point where they can find a form of reconciliation, or until a point where they are able to move past it and be a bigger person. And that is what forgiveness is about. It's not about forgiving the person who did the wrong thing, but allowing the individual who was the victim of something bad, who felt wrong, to move past that and feel as though they can live past that. Four things in the speech. Firstly, some points of setup on what the narrative actually looks like and counterfactual. Second, on how resentment is deeply emotionally taxing. Thirdly, on the benefits of reconciliation for close relationships. And finally, on the prevention of animosity in society. First then, on setup. Firstly, what do we think this narrative actually looks like? I think it's four things. The first is that you are open to forgiveness. That is, you're not necessarily expected to immediately be willing to forgive an individual as PM flags themselves, but rather that at a certain point you are open to, for instance, having a conversation that allows that individual to express that they did something wrong, or that you are open to accepting that forgiveness. That is, we don't think you necessarily have to go to that person and directly ask them to forgive you, but rather that you are open to seek that forgiveness at a point where they are willing to do so, or you're willing to have a constructive dialogue where you put your ego aside and put away some of the past grudges that you have. But second, it is just a narrative of being the bigger person. And we know that the reward you get for being the bigger person doesn't necessarily translate to the harm for refusing to do so, as the PM frames. Because they suggest that if you refuse to forgive someone for what was wrong, you get socially ostracized. We will just posit that you are able to be supported and say that is a great thing you're doing by being the big person without being necessarily villainized for refusing to do so. As PM themselves frames, there are large conflicts which I think people and the close friends in particular are likely to understand, well, this is a pretty big deal, and your decision to be the bigger person is a good thing for you, but not necessarily call you out and consistently ostracize you for refusing to do so. But finally, thirdly, we would just note that forgiveness is not equal justification, which means you don't have to necessarily agree with the forgiveness. You don't necessarily have to agree with everything they said, but rather just be open to moving past it. And finally, it is a huge narrative that influences how society operates. That is, it isn't just individual relationships or society. I'll deal with that later. But secondly, what is the counterfactual? Because PM suggests that the counterfactual is that aggressors would face a higher onus and burden to fix the situation. But we know that I'm unclear this doesn't exist already. As in order for the victim to be the bigger person, the aggressor also necessarily has to be encouraged to seek out reconciliation as well. We think how this narrative is one that operates on the victim, which is to say, in the absence of a narrative that a victim should seek to look for forgiveness and seek to be open for forgiveness, they are more likely to be restrictive of when you are willing to forgive things. You're more likely to have your ego up in close fights. You're more likely to think that I was in the right and you were in the wrong in this situation, and so therefore you have to prove that you are in the right in order for me to be willing to forgive you. First argument then on why resentment is deeply emotionally taxing. And we'll just note this incredibly impactful with victims, because PM says that it's emotionally taxing to have people who ostracize you around you. But I don't think this is a narrative that does so. And if you have close friends who are unwilling to empathize with you, I think that's a product of the friends you have, not necessarily the narrative that exists. But why then is resentment deeply taxing? Four things. The first is to say that holding grudges leads to a constant reminder. That is, if you are constantly believing that you're wronged by an individual, a mention of their name, a mention of the circumstances in which it occurred, a mention of the situation that happened, is a reminder for you of the situation that you have unresolved and you have not been able to move past them. By the fact that you are unable to be open to forgiveness and be the bigger person, you have an element of anger and grudge that consistently persists. That reminder, we say, is incredibly harmful, because it means you're less likely to be able to move past it in the long term when you have this inability to forgive. But second, anger itself is tumultuous, which means that the rationalization and denial that you yourself go through is incredibly harmful. And thirdly, anger is a prison in this way. That is, to the extent that you feel this antagonization, you are unable to break past the power that exists. Strong emotions are strong for a reason. Love, hate, anger. These are things that are powerful because you give them power. And to that extent, we say that forgiveness is the thing that relieves you of having to hate, having to dislike an individual for something they did to you. It's the reason why, for instance, oftentimes the family members of victims of horrific crimes will forgive the aggressor, because that is something that allows themselves to be free from the prison of hate that they built themselves into. But finally, we would note that this is harmful to other relationships. If you are constantly holding resentment and you're unopen to forgiveness and you're unopen to dropping your ego in other conflicts, we would say that is just a poor outcome for you and developing other relationships in the future. You're more likely to be vengeful. You're more likely to remember the things that happened and said that this is something that happened to me in the past, this is and this is something that I'm unwilling to deal with. The impacts of this are huge. It means that it's hugely detrimental to your individual well-being and your mental well-being as you progress through life. But also, it means that conflict exists in the longer term. We know that this exists independently of what other people around you think, because it's something that you feel. It's not necessarily something that's imposed upon you, but you're unwilling to be open to forgiveness hurts yourself. Second point then, on why the benefits of reconciliation for relationships are incredibly important, I'll take closing.
If you are someone who experienced horrors post-self, for example, abuse or like sexual assault in the past, how would you feel if your friends are constantly encouraging you to say, oh, you need to forgive them?
I just completely contest that your friends would do that, right? As we get better consent education, to get better sex education, and we have a more empathetic society overall, I don't think people are saying you have to forgive, for instance, someone who has sexually assaulted you, but rather maybe a close conflict that you had. I don't think that's what this debate is actually about. Get into that now. Why is the benefits for reconciliation incredibly important? The context for this is that oftentimes the situation in which you forgive someone isn't one of like a major crime. Like, it's not that someone has sexually assaulted you or someone has like killed a family member, but rather maybe you had a close friend with whom you had a serious disagreement. Maybe something has happened between you and now you're in a bad state. And I would question here, how does government think that this is resolved? Because I would note that egos that individuals have in these situations are often extremely unclear. It's, for instance, very difficult to have an objective wrong when you have two friends who have a disagreement and a fight. Who then is the person who seeks the other person out and seeks to tell them I was wrong for everything? It is the openness of forgiveness that allows those conversations to happen. It's the fact that both individuals go, I am willing to be open to forgiving this person who was once close to me. Those conflicts are able to be dropped. The impacts of this are extremely large, because it means that the vast majority of the most important relationships are the ones we prioritize. We prioritize, for instance, you being able to reconcile with an old friend. We prioritize being able to reconcile with maybe a family member who maybe didn't treat you well in the past but is now willing to move past that. And we would note that having that relationship repaired does just manifestly solve a large degree of issues. For instance, people who have poor, broken families, who in the past have had problems with their parents, who are able to actively find their parents, are able to repair some of those family dynamics that they lost in the past. We think those are incredibly important things and only happen if you are able to put aside the fact that there is somehow someone who's objectively wronged you. It is never that clear cut, meaning that you need this narrative in order to encourage both people to come to the table. That is the only way to achieve that. Finally then, on social animosity. We would just know that society is one that is being built on forgiveness is a good thing. It's good to have, for instance, rehabilitative justice. It is good to have things like the ability for people to not make a mistake and have their lives destroyed for it. We think that forgiveness is important. We're so proud to stand in opposition.
I will flag that I am a bit sick, so if I need to stop to cough, I would appreciate it if you pause.
Totally fine.
We're ready to go? The most insidious claim we hear in that speech is that there is no pressure from your family or your friends to move on from serious harms that have been done to you. But often, obviously, it doesn't look like, come on, you can forgive them. Sexual assault isn't that bad, although it often does. Look at the media, look at the way the government treats instances of sexual assault as like rubbish and crap or whatever the fuck Scott Morrison called it, as opposed to like a genuine life-ruining harm. But this often manifests as going like, come on, it's been a while since you were in a relationship with that guy. I know he didn't treat you very well, but the fact that he is at the party is not a good enough reason for us not to go. It looks like, oh, you know, I know your mum was a bit shitty to you when you were younger, but that does not mean that she should not be able to call you on your birthday. It looks like gradual erosions of boundaries in a way that is incredibly, incredibly harmful for the people that are experiencing them, that are simply immeasurable from the outside and are often undetected by the people who are perpetrating these harms because they see it as them nudging their friend towards normalcy and towards virtue. That is an insidious and insurmountable harm that exists on the opposition case and is not one we can stand for. For a few things in the speech. The first is to crystallize the counterfactual. Then I'm going to talk about emotional taxation, and under that, the idea that holding a grudge grudge is actually an act of self-love. And lastly, on this idea of prioritizing important relationships. Firstly, on the counterfactual. Crystallizing what this narrative looks like. OO claims two things. The first is to say that this actually doesn't look like, it looks like people being open to forgiveness, not mandated to forgive. But I think the problem with that is that you expect at some point in time, people will be open to forgive. So you do initiate those conversations being like, are you ready to forgive me yet, etc. Like calling like, it's been like 3 days or whatever since we had our argument. Can you like reply to me? And I think that is, the expectation that someone is open to it looks like a requirement they at some point acquiesce to that. And again, it places the burden on the person who is aggrieved to be the one to turn that down, as opposed to the inverse, which I'll talk about in a second. But secondly, they say, well, it actually manifests as like kind of a carrot of like, you could be the bigger person. But I think like if you think that is something that you could never be, obviously that is something that is hurtful to you. That is to say, if you're told you will be the bigger person, if you forgive that person for like cheating on you, for instance, I think that if that's something that you know you will never be able to access, that probably feels pretty shit. In terms of the counterfactual, the first push we get is in a POI from CO, which is to say, oh, revenge. Firstly, beyond the fact that they do actually have to prove this, I think this is a super unlikely narrative. Firstly, because the narrative that we are talking about comes from an internal place of like desiring conflict ends, which is like, because once you forgive someone, you can move on. I think the likely counterfactual is moving on in some other capacity, as opposed to perpetuating a cycle of violence, because that is more like personally gratifying. Secondly, because the main perpetrators of this narrative are religions, which have like for instance, Christianity, seems kind of unlikely that they would be like, Jesus should have killed everyone, as opposed to dying for their sins, right? And thirdly, I think so like the desire for revenge exists in the status quo. I don't think this is a mutually exclusive narrative. I don't think this is the likely supplanter of it. In terms then of what OO say, they say, well, the counterfactual we're talking about where the burden rests on the perpetrator exists in the status quo. But I would say, no, look again at all the examples I give you in my introduction. It seems very clear that people, the burden of forgiveness is largely, maybe to some extent there's an expectation that people express remorse, but the idea is that once you express enough remorse, someone will forgive you. Remorse is a path to proving that you are deserving of forgiveness. Again, that burden still rests on the forgiver, on the aggrieved. And the second thing is, I think the counterfactual that they described, it was just super unclear. They were like, you have to prove forgiveness is warranted. That seems kind of like what their world actually looks like, right? I think the burden very intuitively shifts. What we say on the counterfactual is that firstly, it's unclear this narrative must be supplanted by an equally dominant prescriptive narrative, because the burden is now shifted to the aggressor to say that actually it's not the victim's job to end this conflict. As such, given that the aggression is, I think, much more scalable than capacity to forgive, which is quite binary, like you can tell the difference between like, I don't know, forgetting someone's birthday and cheating on them, they seem like very different harms, whereas something like capacity to forgive either of those seems like binary, you can do it or not, suggesting that the emergent narrative is one that is much more proportional. But secondly, probably just looks like even if it does result in a super punitive revenge-driven narrative, I think it is just justified to place the burden on the aggressor. Firstly, because people who have committed harms have done wrong, and secondly, because they opted into causing harm as opposed to being the victim of harm, which is not something you consented to. Let's now talk about the emotional tax of a grudge, but before I do that, I'll take closing.
Okay, can you actually explain what the likely alternatives are for people who are otherwise have been wronged, for example, if they can't seek forgiveness from them? Like, what is the alternative that you allude to but never explain?
You can seek forgiveness on your own terms. It's just insofar as there is like the conflict being resolved, the expectation is not on you to forgive them. The expectation is on the other person to make it up to you by expressing their remorse. And then it is, if you choose, you don't have that social pressure of people telling you you should be moving on by now because the burden was never on you in the first place. We have been crystal clear that was a waste of a POI. In terms of the emotional tax, of like holding on to a grudge, what we get from the OO is to firstly say that anger is a prison and it is especially harmful. Firstly, I don't think that is always true. Anger is often something which is quite righteous. It can the feeling of like, fuck, it fucking sucks that people are racist to me, for instance, sure it can be unpleasant, but it does not mean that you are trapped in a prison of your own expression, of your own experience. Secondly, I think it's super unclear that anger does not accrue under the world that they describe as well. It's just that anger then is, you're forced to suppress anger in a world where you're expected to forgive. And thirdly, even if it is true that anger is so unpleasant, they need to prove it is likely that people will on our world hold on to that anger instead of forgiving someone for no other reason than like the narrative of forgiveness not existing. Obviously, if it was personally preferable to let go of that anger, people are obviously going to do it, as we explained. This debate takes place in a context where the decision to forgive is one that people are apprehensive to make, not because they're bound by a narrative not to forgive, but because it is something that, but because they don't want to forgive that person, but society tells them it should. The next claim they make is that like, oh, your future relationships could be harmed. I think that's just a byproduct of this framework. If you don't associate forgiveness with virtue, it's unclear why people would look down on you for not forgiving people. The other claim I want to make here, sorry, I'm losing my voice. Can I actually pause my timer super quickly? Sorry, I just have to unlock my phone. Would you help me out?
6:28. Do you want a tissue?
I've got some. I need to better immune system. Alright.
No rush, take your time.
I may redact. Sorry.
Fair shakes.
Alright, so, you've got me at 6:28.
6:28, yeah.
Alright, I'll resume now. The next claim I'm going to make here is to whip the claims that we brought you previously about holding on to grudges being an act of self-love. The idea is if you are able to retain this sense that someone wronging you was something that is objectively bad, that you do not have to move on from, that fortifies your sense of self, that fortifies the idea that you are someone who is deserving of being treated well, as opposed to a doormat that has to be walked all over. I think that is especially important because it means that this is actually something which is a reclamation of harm as opposed to a cause of one. The last thing I want to do is quickly touch on this point they make about you can prioritize important relationships. Firstly, harmful or abusive relationships are not worth repairing. I think if you do decide to cut a family member out of your life because they are damaging to you, that's probably for the best. The claim that they make as to like, oh, this harm is not objective, like nothing is, except for your feelings. Proud to govern.
I'd like to welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
That's not bad, right? I don't know. Yeah.
The existence of a narrative does not push people to experience social critique if they do not follow that virtue. The existence simply encourages the average person, particularly taught to you when you were young, that forgiveness is a good thing. It teaches you that forgiveness would make you feel better. What it doesn't teach you is that forgiveness is the only acceptable outcome, and it doesn't teach you to go hurt other people and bully other people because they won't forgive. It doesn't teach you any of that. Firstly then, I'm going to talk about the fake forgiveness stuff they give us very, very briefly, then on social outcomes, then on the individual, and lastly just to whip some of the material that we get. Firstly on fake forgiveness then, I think they explain that the expectation that society pushes on you to need to forgive means that you might openly pretend to forgive someone that's really harmful. First of all, again, deny the fact that there is a societal pressure to force people to forgive in a public way or just force people to forgive in general. I think that the virtue of forgiveness is just, the idea that forgiveness is good. I don't think there's any social pressure in that way. But firstly, I don't think that this particular fake forgiveness point is common. I don't think it happens very often or impactful. I think the only instance I can think of in which you would give a pretend to forgive someone openly in public is maybe like corporate courtesy, in which you're at a corporate meeting, you're like, yeah, I'm not mad at Marge anymore, because you don't want to be openly mean and make yourself take yourself like someone that holds grudges, right? So I think that pretending that you forgive someone in public just kind of makes you seem like a better person, and it's just better for you in general. Then on to social impacts. I think they give us a lot about the aggrieved being the harm the most, and they give us very, very heavy examples about sexual assault and just really violent crimes. I think firstly, if you look at the status quo, obviously forgiveness is known as a good thing. I don't think anybody is pressuring a victim to forgive their abuser in the way that they claim. I don't think it is. I don't think people are typically not weird like that. Your very close friends are not going to be like, oh, you should forgive the person that assaulted you. That doesn't happen. And even if they try to claim that it's implicit, I feel like those are just bad friends. And very importantly, I want to explain that like virtues and narratives have exceptions. As in the virtues and narratives that exist in the world have certain exceptions that means that people are not going to push them upon you in that circumstance because they're not black and white. For example, white lies. They're generally seen as acceptable because you make everybody happy overall. They're not things that are very impactful because they're little lies that just make everyone happy, and no one's going to be like, oh, you're a liar, you're a horrible person, you went against the philosophy and principle of whatever because you gave a white lie. So I think there are particular exceptions. Obviously, in terms of sexual assault, that's going to be an exception in which it's not socially acceptable to be like, oh, you have to forgive your assaulter. Simply then explain like there is no social support. I'm confused as what kind of social support they're talking about because I feel like in cases where you are wronged, that is a very private thing and private to you. You're unlikely to tell anybody. But even if you do tell other people, it's probably going to be people that you're very close to, people that you love, people that will support you and not do things like pressure you to forgive them. They might say like this may make you feel better and alleviate some of that stress if you're able to move past it. But they're not going to be like, oh, you're a bad person if you don't move past it. And in cases of very violent crimes, they're not even going to like. It's very unlikely they'll say that. They then mentioned that this kind of pressure does exist because you see it in the government, with the government pushing out. You see it in the media. I think firstly, this is just not the fault of forgiveness. It's simply just because of political incentives and general misogyny. I don't think forgiveness has anything to do with that. And note that these kinds of media pushes is never about teaching the victims to forgive, because then those type of right wingers would just be admitting that it's wrong. They're instead just saying that these victims aren't real and the hurt that you've experienced isn't real. So obviously they're not going to be pushing for forgiveness because they think that there's nothing to forgive, which is bad. All right, then moving into the individual. I think the important thing is that they explain that the burden is then on the individual, and that is bad. I think firstly, they give an example of someone, like if you don't speak to them, and then someone says, oh, can you please speak to me? It's been 3 days and you need to reply to me. I just don't firstly, I don't think that is a particular burden as big as they're trying to claim. Because firstly, asking someone to speak to you is not a result of the expectation of forgiveness. I think it is being human. When you care about someone, when someone's your friend, and you have a relationship with them, they don't speak to you for 3 days and you're unsure of what you did wrong, or you know what you're doing wrong and you want a chance to repair that, it is very normal to text them and be like, hey, I don't know what happened, why aren't you replying to me? I think that if they prefer a world where people don't do that, where people aren't expecting to have a conversation about being ignored, I think that they're creating a world of psychopaths in which nobody feels anything. So I think that when you have a person that you care about and you want to know why they hurt you or want to know why they're not speaking to you, that's just a part of being human, that's a part of being a person that has feelings, and that's really important. Yeah.
If people see forgiveness as healing, why wouldn't well-meaning people advocate for it?
Sorry, what? I didn't hear you.
If people see forgiveness as healing under your world, why wouldn't well-meaning family and friends advocate for forgiveness?
Right. Here's the thing. So forgiveness, again, firstly, I explained earlier why certain virtues have exceptions, as in, in the case of violent crime, I think that forgiveness in that way is kind of different, because it's not like a kind of resentment or a grudge you're holding against. If they committed a crime against you, I think there's a grudge, there's a fact that existed. The difference is that when you don't have a world where they teach you that forgiveness is important, or you don't have family and friends say you should learn to forgive, that in instances of interpersonal conflict that are normal, that are petty, that are just like little things, you're less likely to forgive them, and you're more likely to create a community in which animosity is generated between different people, because you aren't taught that forgiveness is an important thing. You aren't taught that forgiveness will make you feel better. Forgiveness as something is just not very intuitive. It feels like it's not something that's for you, it feels like it's something for others. If you don't have a word that teaches you that forgiveness is good, you'll feel like it's for others and you'll never actually do it. But when you are taught that virtue, then you'll know that forgiveness is something that actually makes you feel better, and that's why people are more likely to then heal under that. Okay. And then, last thing then is it explained that the burden is not on the aggressor, and it should be on the aggressor, and also that means that you can shift the burden from the victim to the aggressor. I think firstly, we explained to you at leader of opposition that carrying anger and having grudges that pull you down are much more of a burden on your emotional toll. And the reason behind that is that you're always going to be hurt by it. As if maybe a year or two ago somebody hurt you, if you don't forgive them, maybe a friend brings that person up, and you're still going to be angry, and you're still going to shit talk them, and you're still going to say all these bad things about them because you've held on to that anger. And that means it's bad. That means that you're always going to be burdened by that thing that happened. I think that they explain that anger can be good or anger can be cathartic. I think that might be true. I think resentment is not cathartic, and resentment is not good. And when you do not have forgiveness, you create resentment. That anger never gets released. It instead turns into resentment. It turns into something that buries, and then it becomes a prison that we told you about. Last thing is just like the burden is still going to be on the, I just think the burden will still be on the aggressor, because obviously if you care about someone, you want to give them a chance to communicate. But lastly, I think very importantly, when you forgive, you gain control of how you feel. If you hold on to a grudge, you're giving that control away to the person that hurt you.
Cool. I'd like to thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition. We now move to the closing half of this debate. To kick that off, I'd like to welcome the Member for Government. Here.
Three contributions from closing government. I'll first explain why you, with absent this narrative, are able to decide whether to forgive well or not to forgive, or to forgive or not to forgive well. Then I'll explain that this narrative is something that is incredibly harmful for getting any form of social movements and social change. And finally, I'll explain why we are able to insulate victims from future harm incredibly effectively. In terms of the first extension about why you are able to decide whether to forgive or not in a good way, I would note this deals with the vast majority of the OO claims. Because they are like, oh, forgiveness, like doing forgiveness is really good, therefore if you, and like resentment is really harmful. But at the end of this, obviously, if that is the case and you would just choose to forgive on either side of the house, you don't need the narrative and the action nudge to do it. Okay, there are a few, and I would note that OG identifies this, but we're just going to add more reasons why you are able to make that decision in a good way and get over OO that way. A number of reasons here. The first thing to just say is that you obviously have an intimate knowledge of both yourself in terms of like what you want emotionally. Maybe you are a type of person with resentment is particularly good for, particularly bad for, but also your own experience with that particular individual person. You are someone who is able to know that something particularly well. But secondly, often you know the other person who was involved in this scenario. You know whether this was something that was like a blip for them and something that you want to forgive, or a pattern of behavior, whether this is something that is related to quite something that's like integral to their identity and they don't think they'll be able to change in the future, or whether you forgiving them would actually be particularly rehabilitative to them because you're likely to have a long-term relationship with that person. You are able to make that decision well. Thirdly, often you can observe others' experiences, right? If OO is right and everyone gets eaten up by resentment, you see your friend being eaten up by resentment and you're like, no, that seems pretty cringe. Let's not do that. I will forgive that person. And the final thing is that you can just change over time, right? Maybe you don't want to forgive them immediately, and that's fine. But if it gets 6 months in and you are being eaten up by resentment, you can go back and be like, no, it would actually be quite productive to me to forgive them. What that you should believe at the end of that is that the change in this debate is like the set of people who would forgive, who would be actually bad for them to forgive, and that is a particularly high impact case there. Second extension, why this narrative is incredibly harmful for social movements. Because I would note that the opening half of this debate is incredibly focused on individual interactions and interpersonal stuff, but often this is like wronging someone can look like something that an individual does to you, but power structures can wrong you and other things can wrong you in a way that's particularly harmful there. Interpersonal lives and emotional stuff is quite complex. We would suggest that social change is a lot more clear-cut and is something that is able to get a lot of benefits there. The first part of this extension will just essentially explain why this harms social movements and their ability to get a series of change. Because I would note that often marginalized groups are just classes of victims. People have been victimized by the patriarchy, they've been victimized by like homophobia, they've been victimized by racism and that type of stuff there. This harms social movements in a number of ways. Firstly, it is often weaponized by power structures to be like, no, that anger is unjustified. No, you should be reconciliatory a lot more. And that is something that's particularly harmful because those are people who are able to influence things like media in a way that's particularly harmful there. But secondly, often this just like plays into our broader perception of social movements like, are perceived. So like maybe your moderate person looks at social movements movement. They're like, oh no, they really should be approaching this more from a place of forgiveness and something that's particularly important. And that's particularly important because you do need to like persuade people in terms of things like referendums and stuff that necessarily happen there. The third is that the individuals are a lot less likely to opt into these movements as like if they're a member of a marginalized group, because they're like, oh no, this is something that's quite bad because it's not focusing on forgiveness in a way that's particularly harmful. And I would note as well that finally, although some social movements do preach forgiveness, it's important that there's a broad variety of social movements that are involved as well. Like the Black Panthers were obviously not like pretty forgiveness filled, even if MLK was. But having the Black Panthers like existing was a particularly important like way of shifting the Overton window and actually getting a series of civil rights changes. The second part of this extension, why will it just explain why this narrative in particular is something that is particularly destructive to those social movements. Firstly, I would just say that this is just something that is instilled quite strongly in people from a young age, and they are quite often unable to like delineate how they think about like the more social world and how they think about their interpersonal interactions, right? They think like forgiveness is good on an individual level. They probably think it's good like between like groups of people on like a more social level and that type of stuff. But secondly, I would note that it's often now much less okay to be like overtly racist or sexist or homophobic than it once was. So you do need to rely more on these types of like more subtle narratives to delegitimize these series of movements in a way that's particularly harmful. Thirdly, often this is quite bad for figureheads because that delegitimizes their anger in particular. So you like say like, oh, like Greta Thunberg should just like get over it or that type of thing. Or it's much less compelling you're a survivor of like sexual assault or something because you are more able to personally attack them if you're opposing the social movement. And I would just say as well, the resentment that OO identifies is a particularly important driver of social change. It gets people to protest, gets people to rallies in a way that's particularly important. And I would note finally that the types of people who are involved in these social movements are the types of people who this norm is most likely to punish because they're like often marginalized. They're like economic and political capital. They need that social capital which is degraded by this norm there because they are not seen as legitimate. At the end of this, the weighing is quite simple. I think even if you believe there's a relatively low probability that this does like change certain things like social structures, that is something that's massive within the debate because these are existential issues that apply to people. And I would note that this applies to in a like slightly different way to every single social movement and every single social issue because if people are angry about it, they've been victimized and they deserve to be able to like use that anger productively.
Social conditions reward depend on activists like MLK being seen as forgiving and virtuous of being so. Under your counterfactual, doesn't it make you more ostracized and isolated?
Okay, I think the most important thing to note about that specific example is often like, MLK did need to have the Black Panthers being so strong and being able to like get people, to those like rallies and stuff there and be able to use those more like anger means in order to actually get any of that social change in a way that's particularly important. I'll finally explain why we insulate victims from future harm. I want to be really clear here. Obviously getting harmed in the future is not by any means the victim's fault. There are subtle things that you can do in your lives, like maybe not like go back to a manipulative friend or not making future manipulative friends or like get in like potentially dangerous situations with like someone who might like emotionally manipulate you and that type of stuff there. I would say that this just flips OO stuff about, oh, you get a constant reminder of this. This extension will explain that constant reminder is a very good thing. The first thing I would just explain is this just gets you out of bad situations because you are much less likely to go back to that person both for that reconciliatory conversation but also in terms of like you've de-weighed what they've done within your head. But secondly, you're more able to recognize the patterns of their behavior in the future. You know what a manipulative friend looks like. And also you do see others experience this type of stuff and realize how bad it is. Forgiveness precludes all of this positive stuff in a number of ways. One, in order to forgive, often you have to downplay the harm that was done to yourself. You have to secondly, like, try and get a more nuanced understanding and be less like black and white about the situation, which means that maybe you don't believe everyone who acts some way is bad and they have specific things, so you're more likely to put yourself in a dangerous situation there, and you're like less able to discuss this with others because often they are less receptive to it, but also because you subconsciously self-select out because you don't want all of that social harm. At the end of this, you are able to potentially reduce the future harm that accrues to these types of people. Incredibly proud to CG.
Cool. I'd like to thank the government member for that speech and invite the opposition member to open a case for closing opposition.
Ready? I'm going to start this speech on a question of framing. And the reason why I'm starting here is because teams in this debate are extraordinarily uncomparative as to how people behave without forgiveness. So I'm going to, I guess, respond to all the stuff about revenge and explain why that's extraordinarily likely to occur and explain why that wins the debate. And especially, closing government tries to explain that forgiveness and revenge are like symmetric in 90% of like interpersonal conflicts. So I'm going to explain that the difference is then in the most marginalized communities, the communities that do not have the capacity to seek revenge, that are getting extraordinarily oppressed against, and crucially, when you as a marginalized person forgive someone on your own terms, at the very, very least, you get some sense of resolution with yourself and your own identity. But comparatively, if you expect your aggressor to come and apologize to you, nothing ever happens for the very simple reason that in the 90% of cases where you have marginalized groups being oppressed, the aggressor does not understand what they are doing wrong. They do not think that they're doing anything wrong. They often believe that they're actually justified in oppressing you. And thus the precise sets of instances where the most harm occurs, because the aggressor does not realize they're doing anything wrong. They do not feel any sense of guilt or shame, and so they continue perpetuating harm. And that's the precise case where closing opposition will actually take the debate, because we have an impact that protects these types of people who lay on revenge. So with that in mind then, I'm going to explain why through this through that lens, I'm going to explain why it's uniquely important then that we don't have acts of revenge being encouraged, and why that's likely to occur, to respond to opening government's quibbles, and then, crucially then, why that's so good for like vulnerable communities. So, firstly, how does the norm of revenge actually like spread? Because this is the comparative that government revenge entirely misses, right? I'd firstly point out that the reason why we have like strong narratives like forgiveness in the status quo is just because of religion, right? This is quite like, I don't think that's really contested. But when you remove that, right, it means that people now become angrier when someone transgresses them. They seek destructive solutions, and they see this as moral and justified because there's no countervailing norm or countervailing information to tell you that you should be forgiving or like, you know, let this one slide, right? And I think you know this for the very simple reason that when someone hits you, you feel like a primal instinct to just hit them back, right? It is literally just a primal instinct that most people feel. Revenge is just something that is like genuinely something that most people do feel. I can't really explain it better than that opening government, I'm sorry, but it is just true that most people do seek revenge in most instances. So then, I think that means that the disappearance of this norm means that the only recompense people can feel is through revenge for those very, very simple primal reasons, right? And this is an inordinate harm that would occur because the comparative that has to be defended here is that people seek revenge on government, and so when someone transgresses against you, you kind of have three options here. One, you either just go seek revenge. Two, you just do nothing and just fester. Or three, you just forgive them, right? So I'm going to go through each of those comparatives and explain why forgiveness is just the necessarily best option for a person, especially for a marginalized group, right? Because the greater the emotional or physical harm that someone feels, the more justified people would feel to seek things like revenge without these narratives, right? And it is just things like eye for an eye that would otherwise justify people to seek very destructive solutions, particularly when something very destructive has occurred to them. So that means then that they think that taking your aggressor down is the correct solution in that instance. So it means then, in the set of instances where people seek revenge, they do so in very, very destructive ways. They do things like commit acts of violence, they do things like commit acts of political oppression, particularly when you have minority groups, for example. They do things like commit acts out of hatred because they feel like it is justified because it's an eye for an eye, right? So, and especially in like instances where like there's conflict, for example, between states are probably less likely to feel than form peace treaties with their enemies that they've defeated in war. For the very simple reason that they see that their enemy has deliberately crippled them throughout warfare. No, thank you. So they're probably very, very likely in return to seek very, very harsh peace reparations, for example. And I think you kind of know this because if you believe that the World War I like Treaty of Versailles was already quite, you know, like fucked up in terms of like what France did. Imagine if you didn't have Britain, who was like all like the big forgiving party, and now instead you just have France and Britain like basically telling Germans to go fuck themselves. Obviously, the entirety of revenge would have enormous harms on Germany, for example, and that is precisely why you get huge harms in this debate, because when you have marginalized groups necessarily getting oppressed, it obviously incurs more harms and gets benefits for the people seeking that revenge. So that means then that also in instances like relationships, for example, when you have people aggressing against partners who have wronged them, you also probably would otherwise want to seek constructive solutions that at least get a sense of closure. Comparatively, if you don't want to seek that closure, you probably have no reason to actually try and engage in something that actually is mutually beneficial for both parties. You're probably more likely to seek destructive solutions that maybe you feel slightly good in the short term, but obviously have huge harms in the long term that necessarily outweigh everything government bench says. So then are the people, no thank you, who feel like would probably otherwise do nothing. I'd firstly point out that the people who do nothing in instances where they've been transgressed against feel probably very, very confused, because they never do things like forgive their oppressors, but they never actually do anything in terms of revenge, right? So all like the stuff about like self-love and stuff like that Oscar talks about doesn't really manifest, especially for the most marginalized groups who just do not have the capacity to do anything other than forgive, right? Because when they cannot revenge against their aggressors, obviously that means that what probably gets better self-love for like these marginalized groups probably is just things like forgiveness. It is just the fact that accepting the fact that the situation is the way it is, instead of trying to get revenge, for example, when you don't have the capacity to do so, when we're particularly oppressed, and therefore any instance of revenge is likely to be doubly punished and doubly fuck you over, is probably something that's probably best, especially in the instances of a marginalized group. So, I'll take.
There's a massive difference between declining to forgive and ending a relationship and pursuing active revenge. Why is it likely our people do something illegal, at minimum socially risky, rather than just refusing to continue a relationship?
Okay, so I explained that in the instances of where you have, for example, forgiveness, right? It's probably best when it probably occurs in the instances where the aggressor otherwise does not understand what they're doing is wrong. So otherwise, comparatively, the aggressor will just keep aggressing on that person and keep committing no thank you transgressions against them. So when you actually at least have sense of forgiveness, you can at the very, very least get some sense of resolution. Obviously, that outweighs anything you might bring to the table in opening government. No thank you. So that means then that forgiveness on our side just allows a sense of absolution with the past, even if it might not fix everything. It just gives you a sense of closure, which is so important, especially since it dodges all the destruction harms that revenge has, right? So that means it's probably good for achieving things like practical outcomes in terms of reparations and amends, and I'll go on to this later. So what that does is it outweighs the government bench, because the metrics of self-love are kind of just co-opted here. But secondly, the metrics of justice and revenge and satisfaction are just unconducive and do just cause more harms than they do have benefits. Finally then, on marginalized groups, I'll point out that I guess as opening opposition pointed out in the POI, but we're going to make this, is that leaders like MLK and Gandhi do just use forgiveness as their dogma, right? Because the optics of forgiveness is far more palatable in the eyes of your oppressors compared to being revengeful and vengeful. Because when you are vengeful as a marginalized group, what then your oppressor sees is that your oppression is justified because you are a violent group. So in turn, they doubly fuck you over now because they see that as justified. So comparatively, if you are a marginalized group and you seek forgiveness, at the very, very least, in terms of optics, you can get far better outcomes in terms of reparations and future outcomes, as historically leaders have done in throughout the civil rights movement, for example. And these are obviously huge benefits for these marginalized groups. So we clearly outweigh opening government on their own criteria here, because we actually get better outcomes for this most vulnerable sets of people. Clearly why we win this debate.
Sorry, can I run to the bathroom?
Yeah, sure.
With what moving on looks like. I think both forgiveness and revenge are forms of accessing catharsis as a victim. The difference between forgiveness and revenge is that one, the former is long-term, and B, the latter is short-term, as I'll explain. What I think the opening half fails to deal with in this debate, and what we actually think on closing is the most important thing in this debate, is what does forgiveness versus revenge look like for the people who experience transgressions when the aggressor does not believe they did anything wrong? Note that the only response we get to this POI/material from OG is well, they can access this in other ways when the oppressor comes to them and tries to make it up to you. If you are in a set of circumstances where somebody has done wrong by you, but does not believe they have done wrong by you, that is the point in which you cannot access any external support. You cannot access any closure. Those are often the circumstances in which you feel the most harm. You feel the most alone. You feel the most wronged because you yourself feel like you are being ridiculed by everyone around you. Nobody takes you seriously. No, thank you. Nobody believes you. We think these are the people that experience the most amount of harm. At the very least, the only making up you get is this fakeness and this insincerity. We think this is just the most harmful scenario in this debate. We explain this on the individual level and we explain this on a broader level. We think that when you are not believed and when you are not taken seriously, that is the point where the deep-seated resentment that OO explains builds up in you, and the worse those transgressions are, the worse your acts of revenge become. No thank you. We think those things directly scale for the reasons that I will explain. Okay, let's deal with the bulk of OG's material as quickly as possible. The first thing we would like to point out is that forgiveness and the pursuit of forgiveness as such can actually push you to surmount your problems instead of dwelling within your problems. Obviously, this might be unfair to push people to not feel like they have to get over problems that other people have committed on them. But often we think it is just the best thing for that person. It is better for you to find a way over your problems as an individual than it is to sit there and wallow in your own depression and sadness, to do things like let resentment build up and not access forms of support or consideration. That is something that is actively harmful for you. And we think when you have no avenue to forgiveness, when you cannot find a way to say to yourself, I am bigger and better than them. I am more than the situations and the wrongs that have been committed against me. I forgive the act that has been done and I am going to move on with my life. That is the scenario in which individual forgiveness you can only access yourself when a perpetrator does not admit that they have done wrong to you. That is something that is, no thank you, uniquely accessible on our side, that is not accessible on opening government. Okay, we also think you can choose to forgive a person but then not choose to continue or rebuild a relationship as well. We think those two things are not one and the same. I.e. you can forgive someone from an act done against you, but you do not have to actively invest in rebuilding that relationship if you do not want to. Okay, I think that deletes the bulk of OG's material. Just to hammer that home, I'd like to point out that OG's job was actually to prove the way that other people move on from conflict is accessible. I've already proven why they actually don't meet their burden on this in this debate. I'll give them a last chance at a POI.
So beyond how condescending it is to assert that marginalised communities have no capacity to self-actualise, your extension is flipped in Oscar's speech when they explained, to no response down the bench at all, that the forgiveness marginalised people are forced to adopt to be taken seriously in your world is actively deleterious.
I am literally going to get to that in 30 seconds if you can believe me. It will. I'm going to deal with this in response to the social movement stuff that CG gives us. Because we're going to explain why, at the point in which you continue to act out and pursue acts of revenge, because you do not want a point of reconciliation, because you do not feel that is a viable option for you as a social movement, that is the point in which your demands do not get taken seriously. That is the point in which institutions just do not buy what you are selling. They do not actualize any change for you. I'll explain that now. Let's talk quickly about how CG responds to our revenge analysis, which is just to be super uncharitable. They're like, oh, well, you would never do anything illegal, so you would never commit an act of revenge. Like they're countervailing like norms here. Who just explained that the revenge obviously scales with the amount of transgression that you've done. For example, if somebody insults me, I'm not going to kill them or commit huge acts of bodily harm against them. But if somebody punches me in the face, as Sean explains, I probably want to punch them in the face back. The difference is, I feel in more scenarios and more options where that occurs, I am more likely to punch them in the face under government than I am under our side, because there are two options. There is, you cop it and you fester that resentment, or you act out. We have three alternatives: you forgive, foster that resentment, or you act out. Just mathematically, we think you actualize on revenge in more cases. Let's now talk about CG's case. They have three pushes. The first is well, you can decide to forgive well or to not forgive well. The first thing we would explain is that this does not work when the countervailing narrative is just revenge. If forgiveness is not presented to you as being good in society, it's not something that you are likely to seek out as a form of long-term catharsis. That is because forgiveness is often a difficult process. It requires you to contemplate and reminisce on transgressions that are against you. It does not allow you that immediate relief from the harms that you are experiencing that you could get from revenge. Obviously, you could feel better about someone who has wronged you by shit-talking them or by turning your mutual friends against them or whatever it is, but we don't think that's sustainable for you in the long term, because it only leads to more of the social rejection that you experience. It only leads to more of people getting pissed off at you when you hold on to problems, when you don't seek to forgive. All of the harms that OG tells you about how people get annoyed at you when you don't get over your problems, and people get annoyed at you when you don't fix your problems, no thank you, just gets exacerbated, because if you never reach a point where those conflicts are resolved, you hold on to them for longer and longer. You get ostracized more and more. You may lead to an act of revenge or violence that people do not tolerate and people do not accept within your social circle. That is the point at which you are more likely to be shunned. We think this translates directly over to social movement. We think it gives you a really bad rap on optics when all you want is revenge. You don't want to participate in constructive dialogue around forgiveness and reconciliation and talking about things like reparations in response to radical social movements. CG's extension is that radical social movements are necessary for change, but we also tell you the forgiveness aspect is probably what's the most important. It's when you sit down with your oppressors after, in response to your radical actions, and you decide on a path forward. You decide on change, you decide on legislation that may be passed. That see the negative optics-based reactions you had to the riots aspect of the Black Lives Matter protests, right? That was obviously terrible for optics, but it was the revenge that they felt that they needed because of all of the historic harms and transgressions that they experienced. What was crucial was that the split of the Black Lives Matter movement that was more peaceful had constructive dialogue with people like politicians. That can only be accessed when you can find it within yourself and a movement to forgive your oppressors. We're the only side that does this. We're the only side that actualizes benefits for people who do not have external support and people who do not have their oppressors coming to them to help them solve their problems. This is why you must vote CO.